The worldview represented in the book of Joshua is very different from ours. It is a worldview that believes in many gods. It's polytheistic. And it believes that these gods are regional, that each god reigns over a particular territory. And to go from one territory into another is to go into the domain of a different god. And depending on who is in power, whether it's this particular tribe or that tribe, that's seen as reflecting whose God is stronger. Joshua, though, is addressing the people at a time when they've just finished a long and tough conquest. And he is saying to them that the God whom he and his family chooses to serve, the God who brought them through this ordeal, is one who transcends geographic boundaries. People at that particular time thought that what happened in the heavens reflected what they knew there on earth, where they had a king who would be powerful and protect them, or in some cases a warlord who would control a group of people for a time. And they saw that as being reflected in the cosmos. But Joshua is saying to the people, the one whom we are worshiping and acknowledging today is the one who spoke to our ancestor centuries ago. Abraham was from Ur, in the area of Babylon, in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the modern-day city of Baghdad can be found. And Abraham and his family worshipped another god. But Abraham had a vision from God, the God Yahweh, who said to him, "Go to a place that I will show you, and I promise that out of your descendants you will become a mighty nation." And so Abraham wandered, and his descendants wandered too. They found their way through Joseph to Egypt, where they became ingrained in Egyptian life and culture. But then they became under suspicion, and they were enslaved by the Pharaoh. The pharaohs who served and worshipped other gods. Then, after centuries of being enslaved, they are freed from slavery and brought safely through the wilderness after 40 years, where God cares for them, giving them bread and water and quail to provide for them. At the end of that, in our passage that we read last week, Moses stands on a mountaintop and looks over to see the promised land, and then to pass on the mantle to Joshua, who will be there for the conquest. And the conquest doesn't seem to go completely the way they had expected it, because not all of the Canaanites are overthrown. There are some that they form alliances with, in part because they help them, the way Rahab did when they went into Jericho. And others they form alliances with because they are tricked. Joshua is saying to the people, the God who has brought us through this ordeal is the God that goes back to Abraham. A God that has overseen God's people for all of these centuries and has always been faithful to the promises that are made. So Joshua isn't comparative shopping among the different gods of that period, looking around to decide whose God is tougher or more profitable. But he's saying that the God who brought us through this is a God that goes all the way back to our ancestor Abraham. Therefore, the allegiance that he and his household swears to God isn't something that's meant to try to cajole or earn God's favor, but it's just a response to what God has already done. Joshua is recognizing that God has been faithful to his end of the covenant. God has kept his promises. And in gratitude for all that they've gone through and all that they now have placed into their hands, he is swearing allegiance to that God. I think it's difficult for you and I to get our minds around this particular way of thinking about territorial gods and swearing allegiance to God, not because of something we've recognized, but in response for what God has already done. One way to think about that, though, is to reflect on our opening hymn today, America the Beautiful, one that Twyla chose for us to sing today. That is a hymn that, unlike the hymn of a similar name on the opposite page, doesn't go back to the American Revolution, but goes back much further than that. It was written by a woman who was a professor at Wellesley College. And in the 1890s, she took a trip by train all the way from Massachusetts to Chicago to a festival that was supposed to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's exploration of the New World. And along the way, she looked out the windows and she saw the different fields that were where crops were being harvested. And she saw the people who were working in them. She saw the different topography about mountains and plains, and she recognized the natural richness of this area. She also understood and appreciated the richness of our people, whether it was those that were working in the field or those who were captains of industry. In that third verse, there's that allusion to the alabaster cities. That's a mention of a particular type of architecture that was featured at the carnival that she went to there in Chicago. It's a way of celebrating not only who we are as American people, but the talents that each of us provide that have helped build up this nation. She also celebrates the ethical and the moral donations that we make to this country, and the ultimate sacrifices that some have made. Those who more than self their country life, and mercy more than life. That's something that on this Veterans Day weekend in particular is particularly true to us. So America the Beautiful isn't a hymn that goes back to July 4th, 1776. But it celebrates who we are as a part of God's creation. God gave us a land that is rich in natural resources. God gave us talent and intelligence to build and develop this land. It's a way of celebrating our uniqueness, but also acknowledging that we are part of God's magnificent creation. It is a celebration of all that God has put into our hands. It's another way of touching on what Don talked to us about this morning, and what Fran will address us about next week. Right now, we're in the midst of our stewardship campaign. And we're thinking about the resources that God has put into our hands and how we might best utilize them. And it's one of those things that typically comes at this time of year. We live in a culture where we need money because we have bills and creditors. We could maybe stand to replace this microphone that keeps ringing. But it's much more than that. I encourage you not to consider this as some kind of doldrum or necessary evil, but think of it through the lens of America the Beautiful. Think of it through the lens of what Joshua is saying to his people. You and I believe in a God that created the heavens and the earth. We believe in a God that gave us and put us in a land with rich natural resources. A God that gave each of us talents and intelligence that we have used to earn a living and to support ourselves and to support our families. These are all resources that God has given to us. And we are just stewards of those resources God has put into our hands. Bishop Cho, in a sermon, told a story about a man who was being baptized by way of immersion. Before he went under the water, he reached into his back pocket and got his wallet and held it up in the air. And when the pastor asked him what he was doing, he said, "I don't want my wallet baptized too." Sometimes we're like that. We're more inclined to turn our entire lives over to God, particularly when it's relating to our eternal faith. But let me hold on to this pocketbook, or let me hold on to this thing or that thing. The theology of stewardship is about seeing ourselves as a part of God's creation,
showing that our dependence and faith is not in the forces of this world, but in the God who created the heavens and the earth, the God who goes all the way back to Abraham, the God who is always faithful to his promises. There are promises that even go back to the days before Abraham. In the aftermath of the flood, whenever Noah comes out of the ark with his family and all of the animals are then set free, God sets a rainbow in the sky. And in the Genesis text, the term bow is the same term that would be used for a weapon, like a bow and arrow. It's God's way of saying, no longer will I go to war against humanity, but now this is your world, for better or for worse, to live in and to make the most of, to be stewards of. One commentator talking about this Joshua text said the skies are not mentioned there, but he imagined that as Joshua was addressing his people about serving the God who has been good to his promises, he imagined that there was a rainbow in the sky over. Each of us have gotten pledge cards in the mail, and we each have an opportunity to decide what we can give. And I encourage you not to be too quick about this, not to just write down what you did last year or mark it up a % or two, but to consider it prayerfully, to consider who you are as a part of God's world and what resources has God put into your hands. Because when we decide what we're able to give and the ways, because there are some who contribute in labor what they cannot provide in dollar, we are expressing our faith in God, and we are showing that we are good stewards of what has been handed over to us. So I invite you to pray and consider, what does it mean to be a part of God's world, even this land? And how do you and I express our faith in what we give back to God by supporting the ministries of God's church? Amen.